Hello everyone, welcome to your partner in education, Agile Rank Mate. Today, in this episode of IIFT Insights, we're going to be looking at some sample questions of the IIFT examination. Now, IIFT stands for the Indian Institute of Foreign Trading, and today we're going to be looking at questions based on it that are related to logical reasoning. So let's look at these questions and how to solve them effectively. Today's set goes like this. We have directions for 4 questions. Coach Johan sat with the scorecards of Indian players from the 3 games in a one-day cricket tournament, where the same set of players played for India and all the major batsmen go out. John summarized the batting's performance through 3 figures, one for each game. In each figure, the 3 outer triangles communicate the number of runs scored by the 3 top scorers from India. K, R, S, V, and Y represent Kaif, Rahul, Saurav, Virender, and Yuvraj, respectively. The middle triangle in each diagram denotes the percentage of total score that was scored by the top 3 Indian scorers in that game. No 2 players scored the same number of runs in the same game. Now, John also calculated 2 batting indices for each player based on his scores in the tournament. The R index of the batsman is the difference between his highest and lowest scores in the 3 games, while the M index is the middle number if his scores are arranged in a non-increasing order. You need to find, now over here, we see the same graph of the batting performance of the 5 Indian batsmen. Now let's look at the questions, shall we? Question 1, for how many Indian players is it possible to calculate the exact M index? Question 2, among the players mentioned, who can have the lowest R index from the tournament? Question 3, how many players among those listed definitely scored less than Yuvraj in the tournament? And the last question, which of the players had the best M index from the tournament? So, now that we have all of this given in the question, let's find out the answers. Now for that, what we're going to do first is to compile the results of each match. Over here, we know that 90% was scored by these 3 people and their scores are given. However, we need to find the total scores of all the 3 matches so that we can find out what the rest of the people scored. And that is pretty important in solving out some of the questions here. Alright, so the first match is against Pakistan. And over here, 90% of the runs were scored by Yuvraj, Virendra, and Kaif. So 130 plus 40 plus 28 gives you 198. So 90 by 100 times x gives you 198. So the zeros get cancelled, so the value of x is 198 times 10, which is 1980 over 9. So 1980 divided by 9 is the correct number of runs that India scored against Pakistan. So when you calculate that, 2 9s are 18, subtract, you get 1, 8 gets pulled down, so that's 18 again. So you get 0 as the remainder. Since there's an extra 0 here, you put a 0 in here to get the quotient. So therefore, the correct value of x is 220. So against Pakistan, India scored a total of 220 runs. Now that means the contribution of the rest of the batsmen would be 220 minus 198, which in this case is 22 runs. So a total of 22 runs was contributed by the rest of the team, while 3 players scored 198. Now, let's look at the match against South Africa. Now, in the match against South Africa, 70% of the runs were scored by the top 3 batsmen, which in this case is Kaif, Saurav, and Rahul. So Kaif scored 51 runs, Saurav scored 75 runs and Rahul scored 49 runs. So that gives us a total score of 51 plus 49 is 100, plus 75 is 175. So 70% of runs equals 175. So that means 70 over 100 times x gives you 175. We cancel out one of the zeros, so the value of x is 1750 over 7. And when we do that, 1750 over 7, so 7 2s are 14, gives a balance of 3, 5 gets pulled down to give 35, 5 times 7 is 35, remainder is 0, there's still a 0 in the dividend, so you put another 0 in the quotient. So the correct quotient x is equal to 250. So against South Africa, India scored a total of 250 runs. Now that means the contribution of the rest of the batsmen is quite high. In this case, it's 250 minus 175, which is equal to 75 runs. So therefore, against South Africa, India scored, 250 runs. 175 was scored by the three of the top scoring batsmen, while the rest of the team contributed another 75 runs. Now let's look at Australia, the match against Australia, in which 80% of the runs were scored by Rahul at 55 runs, Yuvraj at 87 runs, and Saurav at 50 runs. So you get a total of 192. So that means 80x over 100 gives you 192. Basically, we need to calculate 1920 over 8 to get x. So 1920 over 8. 8 2s are 16. 3 is balanced. 2 gets pulled down, you get 32. 8 goes into 32 4 times. So therefore it's a 0. So the total score of the match against Australia is 240 runs. Now that means the rest of the team contributed a total of 48 runs. So now that we know the scores against Pakistan, South Africa, and Australia, let's look at the contribution of each of the players. Alright? Now across these 3 matches, if we look at the players, the first player that we're looking at is Yuvraj. Why? Now, if you look at the graph, the figure, you see that Yuvraj scored 40 in the match against Pakistan and 87 in the match against Australia. Now, we are not sure if he had scored runs against South Africa because he's not present in the top 3 scores. So therefore, we're going to write South Africa as a placeholder to make sure that he scored runs against South Africa. So when we're writing down the scores, especially here, let's make sure that it's written in the order that they are. So 40 plus South Africa plus 87. This is how Yuvraj's scores are across the 3 matches. So Yuvraj scored a total of 127 runs, and the runs that he scored in his match against South Africa. So 127 plus SA is the score for Yuvraj. Next we have Virendra, represented as V. Now Virendra scored a massive total of 130 in his first match, but then he wasn't present in the top scores of the other two matches. So we can assume that he had scored something in South Africa and scored something against Australia. So therefore we're going to write them as placeholders. So SA plus AUS. So 130 plus South Africa plus Australia is the total score of Virendra. The next batsman on the list is Kaif, who is K. Now the letter K represents Kaif, and as you can see, Kaif has scored 51 runs in the match against South Africa and 28 runs in the match against Pakistan. So Kaif's score reads as 28 plus 51 plus the match against Australia. Now 28 plus 51 gives a total of 79. So Kaif's total score across the three matches is 79 plus the runs he scored against Australia. Next we have Saurav, represented by S. Now Saurav did not score any. Saurav is not on the list against Pakistan, so therefore we will represent it as Pak. Now against South Africa, Saurav scored 75 runs, and against Australia, Saurav scored 50 runs. So we're going to write those down. So now the total score for Saurav across the three matches would be 125 plus the match against Pakistan, where we don't know how many he has scored, but we do know he had contributed to the rest, which scored a total of 22. And finally, we have Rahul, represented as R. Now again, Rahul is not present in the top three scores against Pakistan, so we can assume that he had contributed among the rest. Now against South Africa, Rahul scored 49, and against Australia, Rahul scored 55. So those are the scores for the next two matches. So we get a total of 104 plus the match against Pakistan as the total score for Rahul across the three matches. So now we've compiled out total runs of India against the three teams. How much did the rest score against those three teams? And we also found out the total score of the 5 players in the question. All right. So now question number 1. For how many Indian players is it possible to calculate the exact M index? Now the M index, or the middle index, is referred to as the middle number if scores are arranged in a non-increasing order. Okay, so let's consider the order of the matches as a non-increasing order. So as you can see, if we look at the 5 players, we see that Virendra has 2 variables in his score. So he has the match against South Africa and the match against Australia. In both of these matches, Virendra's score is not known. So therefore, we can exclude Virendra out. We cannot calculate his middle index. Now, what about Yuvraj? Now, Yuvraj has the score against South Africa in question, but we do know that he scored 40 against Pakistan and 87 against Australia. So if you look at the match against South Africa, that's when the rest of the team contributed the most. So a total of 75 runs was contributed by the rest of the Indian team. So therefore, it's quite difficult to find out how much Yuvraj has scored, because since there's a high number of runs contributed by the rest of the Indian team, it could easily have been distributed in any way. So therefore, Yuvraj cannot be considered. Next, we have Kaif. He does have the match against Australia where we don't know his runs. So if you look at the match against Australia, again, there's a high score posted by the rest of the team, 48. So that again can be distributed amongst anyone. So we cannot consider Kaif's application as well. However, if you look at both Saurav and Rahul, we see that in the match against Pakistan, there was only 22 runs. So it is plausible that either Saurav or Rahul could get a maximum of 22 runs against Pakistan and a minimum of 0. So again, it's the same thing. We can't exactly find out what their scores are, but we can safely assume that they might get 22. And even if we take the assumption that they got 22 runs, we see that it does not, it's actually the lowest score for them. So therefore, the middle score would, in fact, in this case, be 50 for Saurav and 49 for Rahul. So the middle index for Saurav is 50 and the middle index for Rahul is 49. So as you can see, both of these players, for both of these players, we can find out their middle index, even if we don't know the exact number of runs that they scored against Pakistan, because it is insignificant. So therefore, option C2 turns out to be the right option. The Indian players whose middle index can be calculated are Saurav and Rahul. Saurav has a middle index of 50, Rahul has a middle index of 49. So option C is the right option. Now the next question. Among the players mentioned, who can have the lowest R index from the tournament? The options are only Kaif, Rahul or Yuvraj, only Kaif or Rahul, only Kaif or Yuvraj, or only Kaif. So these are the 4 options that we have. So as you can see, there are 3 players in question: Kaif, Rahul, Yuvraj. So basically, Virendra and Saurav are not present for their calculation. Now let's consider Virendra's R index. Now the R index basically means highest score minus lowest score. And we need to find the lowest possible value for that R index. Now for the lowest possible value, the lowest score has to be high. And if the lowest score is high, then we can easily calculate how much the difference is, and that difference would be quite low, and then so we can say that the R index is low. So since we need to find out the lowest R index, we will assume that the lowest score is quite high for many of these players. Now for Virendra, we can't exactly calculate it, but against South Africa it's 75, so it's nearly impossible for 75 runs to be taken by one person. The reason being that 75 is the highest score by Saurav, and the next highest score is 51. So it cannot be 75. Virendra cannot take 75 Virendra cannot, take all of those runs. His score has to be less than 49. However, against Australia, the lowest score among the 3 top scorers is 50, and the number of runs scored by the rest of the batsmen is 48. So it is quite possible that Virendra can get a total of 48 against Australia. So let's assume that his score in Australia was 48. So this is the worst possible scenario. So if we take 130 minus 48, the R index for Virendra would stand out to be 82. Now let's look at another person on the list, Saurav. So we have Pakistan, 75 and 50. So lowest score would would be a maximum of 22. The reason being that there's a low score in Pakistan, the match against Pakistan, and the lowest score among the 3 top scorers is by Kaif, which is 28, and the runs scored by the rest of the team is 22. So it's quite possible that Saurav could have scored all of it. So therefore, if we take the possibility then 75 minus 22 would give us 53. So as you can see, Videndra's lowest R index and Saurav's lowest R index is quite high, 82 and 53 respectively. Now let's look at the people in the options. We have Kaif, Rahul, or Yuvraj. So let's take Yuvraj. Now if you look at Yuvraj's scores, we have an 87 scored against Australia, a 40 scored against, let's say, an 87 scored against Australia and a 40 scored against Pakistan. So 87 is his highest score. Now if you look at the match against South Africa, the highest score has to be 40. Now if over here we see that the lowest score among the three people is 49, and the remainder for the of the runs scored by the rest of the team is 75. So therefore we consider that Yuvraj scored somewhere higher than 40 in the match against South Africa. So therefore the lowest score in this particular case would be 87 minus 40. So for Yuvraj, 87 minus 40 gives you 37. Now what about Rahul? Now in Rahul's case, we have the match against Pakistan, 49 against South Africa, and 55 against Australia. So we can consider that against Pakistan he scored 28 because Kaif is the third highest scorer with a total of 28 runs, and 22 is less than 28. So in this particular case, we're gonna look at we're gonna consider Rahul scoring 22 against Pakistan, and his highest score then would be 55. Now over here, 55 minus 22 gives us 33, so therefore Rahul would have the lowest star index would be equal to 33. So what about Kaif? Now before we look at Kaif's, we know that Kaif is present in all of the options, but what we do know is that Rahul's score is lower than Yuvraj's. So Rahul's R index is lower than Yuvraj's, so therefore option A and option C has to be incorrect, because Yuvraj has the highest R index among the three players present in the options, so therefore options involving Yuvraj would have to be disapproved. Now let's look at Kaif's score in order to find out whether the lowest star index is only Kaif's, or if Rahul and Kaif both share the lowest star index. Now if you look at Kaif, you see that he scored 51 against South Africa, 28 against Pakistan, and if you look at the Australian, if you look at the match against Australia, the lowest score in this case is by Saurav with 50, and the rest of the team scored 48 runs. So it's quite plausible that in Australia, Kaif scored 48 runs. So in that case, it would mean that the lowest score by Kaif is against Pakistan, 28. So therefore, therefore the highest score is 51, and the lowest score is 28. So 50 minus 20 gives you 30. 51 minus 8 gives you 43, and 43 minus 20 gives you 23. So as you can see, Kaif's score is 23. Now among the R indexes here, Kaif's R index is the lowest at 23, Rahul's is at 33, and Yuvraj's is at 37. So therefore option D, only Kaif, is the right option. We looked at the worst case scenario. We're in the match score. The lowest score is quite high. The lowest score is the highest possible value for all of these three players. And when we put that in, we found out that Kaif, under any circumstance, would have the lowest score, which in this case is 23. So the lowest possible R index among the players mentioned is only Kaif. Now let's look at this question. How many players among those listed definitely scored less than Yuvraj in the tournament? Is it 0, 1, 2, or more than 2? Okay, so in this case, we need to take out Yuvraj's score. Now, Yuvraj scored 40 against 40 against Pakistan. He scored nothing. He scored something against South Africa, and he scored 87 against Australia. So this is his score. 127 plus South Africa. Now, we need to find out how many players had scored definitely less than Yuvraj. So if we take all possible combinations, some of these players would have scored quite less than Yuvraj. We need to find out how many. So for this to take place, we need to consider two things. We need to take Yuvraj's lowest possible score, and we need to take everybody else's highest possible score. So, and in the highest possible score category, we need to make sure that some of these would be lower than the lowest score of Yuvraj. So let's look at the question itself. So in Yuvraj, he scored 40, 87, and something against South Africa. Now let's consider this something to be equal to 0. So therefore, Yuvraj's lowest possible score is 127 among the 3 matches. Now, if you look at the other players in this case, first off, we can discount Virendra, because as you can see, Virendra's score against Pakistan is already 130. So no matter what other combinations you take, his score is always going to be greater than Yuvraj's lowest score. So Virendra cannot be considered. Now what about Saurav? Now Saurav has, let's say Saurav has 75 and 50 already, so he has 125 plus the score against Pakistan. And it is possible for Saurav to get 22 because the third highest score is 28, and the rest of the team scored 22. So it's possible for Saurav to get 22. Now, if we took 22 and added it to Saurav's score of 125, then as you can see, Saurav does have the possibility of getting more than Yuvraj. So therefore, Saurav, since he can get more, and since if the score in Pakistan is against Pakistan is like more than 2 runs, then Saurav definitely can get more than Yuvraj when it comes to score in the tournament. So therefore, Saurav is also discounted. Now what about Kaif? If we look at Kaif's score sheet, we have 28 and 51. That gives you 79 plus the runs against Australia. Now in Australia, the third highest score was by Saurav with 50. So, and since the rest of the team scored 48, we can definitely add 48 to Kaif's scorecard. So if we add 79 and 48, it's 7, 8, 4, 12. So Kaif's best possible scenario would be equal to 127. And since 127 is equal to the one against Yuvraj, so that particular case would mean that Kaif also cannot be considered. So since Kaif can reach 127, he would be equal to Yuvraj's lowest score. So therefore, we cannot consider Kaif here as well. Well, so we now know that Virendra, Saurav, and Kaif all can get scores higher than Yuvraj's lowest score. So let's look at Rahul. Alright. Now in Rahul's case, he scored 49 and 55 against South Africa and Australia respectively. So that gives him 104. Now against Pakistan, we don't know his score, but we do know that Kaif scored 28 against Pakistan, and that was the third highest score. And the rest of the team scored 22, so therefore it's possible that Rahul scored 22. We're looking at scenarios here, so we're trying to take the best scenario possible. Now, let's make the possibility that Rahul scored all the 22 runs against Pakistan. So that means his total score would be 104 plus 22. 4 plus 2 is 6. 0 plus 2 is 2. And we get the 1. So as you can see, the highest ever possible score that Rahul is ever going to get is 126, which is less than 127. So Yuvraj's lowest possible score is 127. Rahul's highest possible score is 126. So as you can see, Rahul is definitely going to score less than Yuvraj in this tournament. So therefore option B1 is the right option. 0 is incorrect because we know Rahul is definitely less. 2 is incorrect because here we're looking at the worst possible moment, and Virendra definitely doesn't include there because he already has a 130 to his name. Saurav does get the opportunity of getting more than Yuvraj, and Kaif, at this particular case where Yuvraj is 127, then Kaif's best is also 127, so they can be equal. So that's also not correct. The only person who can get definitely less than Yuvraj is Rahul, because his highest score is 126 and Yuvraj's lowest possible score is 127 in the entire tournament. So therefore option B1 is the right option. Now question number 4. Which of the players had the best M index from the tournament? Rahul, Saurav, Virendra and Yuvraj. Now if we look at our first question, we see that Yuvraj, Virendra and Kaif cannot get an M index. Now the reason why they cannot get an M index here, we discussed that in the first question. It's because of the fact that there are a lot of variables in the matches against South Africa and Australia. So Yuvraj and Virendra do not have an M index. Now Saurav has an M index of 50, while Rahul has an M index of 49. So from among the two people who have an M index, we see that Saurav's M index is better than Rahul's. So therefore the best M index in the tournament goes to Saurav. So option B, Saurav, is the right option for this question. Now that concludes this episode of IIFT Insights. We hope you found this episode interesting. For more of our useful and interesting content, don't forget to subscribe to Agile Rank Mate, your partner in education. If you want to get the latest updates from our channel, then please don't forget to hit the bell icon present below the video. So until the next episode, take care, stay alert, bye-bye for now.